Applying was a last-minute decision. I was close to not applying. The listing had been up for 3 days before my roommate found it and slid his laptop across the kitchen table without saying a word. He just watched my face while I read it. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time because I was certain I was misunderstanding something. The listing was short. 6 months. Full-time hours. Competitive pay. The number listed was more than I had made in the previous year combined. The job title said companion. The description said the successful candidate would be required to be present, engaged, and available. It listed things like accompanying the employer to appointments, sharing meals, being available for conversation, joining occasional outings. There was no mention of cleaning. No mention of caregiving in any medical sense. No mention of any technical skill whatsoever. At the bottom it said the employer was a private individual and that the right candidate would be selected through a formal interview process. It gave an email address and nothing else. My name is Declan Hurst. At the time I was 31 years old, recently unemployed, and approximately 6 weeks away from not being able to cover my half of the rent. I had spent the previous 4 years working as a project coordinator for a mid-sized events company that had quietly collapsed from the inside out. I had good references, a decent resume, and no job prospects that were paying anything close to what I needed. I was the kind of person who made sensible decisions and thought things through carefully before acting. I sent the email that same night. The reply came back in less than 2 hours. It was formal and brief and signed by someone named Petra Solano, who identified herself as a personal assistant acting on behalf of her employer. She scheduled me for an interview the following Thursday at an address on the quieter end of the city's historic district, a part of town I had driven through a dozen times but never had a reason to stop in. I told my roommate I had sent the email. He asked if I thought it was real. I told him I had no idea. He said, "Well, what is the worst that could happen?" I said I could waste an afternoon. He said, "Exactly." Thursday came and I put on the best shirt I owned and drove to the address on Kellerman Street. It was a townhouse. 4 stories, pale gray stone, window boxes on the 2nd and 3rd floor with something green and well-tended growing in each one. The kind of building that did not announce itself but did not need to. I rang the bell and a woman in her mid-40s opened the door and introduced herself as Petra. She had a calm, organized manner and the slightly watchful quality of someone whose job it was to pay attention to things other people missed. She led me through the entrance hall, which had dark wood floors and paintings on the walls that I did not know enough about to evaluate but which looked serious, and into a sitting room on the ground floor where 2 chairs had been arranged across from each other near a fireplace that was not lit. She offered me water and I accepted, and she sat across from me with a notepad and asked me a series of questions that were not what I expected. She did not ask about my work history in detail. She asked how I handled long stretches of unstructured time. She asked whether I was comfortable with silence. She asked how I responded when someone I was with was in a difficult mood and had not explained why. She asked what I did when I disagreed with someone but did not have the standing to say so. I answered honestly because I could not figure out what the preferred answers were supposed to be, and honesty felt like the only strategy that made sense. After about 40 minutes, she closed her notepad and looked at me and said she had one more question. She said the employer was a private woman who had recently been through a significant personal loss and who was not in need of a nurse or an assistant or a therapist. She was in need of a person, a consistent, present, reliable person who would show up every day and simply be there. She asked if I understood the difference between that and a job. I thought about it for a moment. "I think so," I said. "One has tasks with endpoints. The other just requires you to be a human being reliably." Petra looked at me for a moment. Then she wrote something on her notepad. "You will hear from us by Friday," she said. I drove home and sat in my car outside the apartment building for a few minutes before going in. My roommate was waiting in the kitchen. I told him it was real. He asked what the job actually was. I thought about how to explain it. "Someone needs company," I said. "That is it. That is the whole job." He was quiet for a second. "That is either the saddest thing you have ever said," he said, "or the best job listing in history." Petra called on Friday morning. Not emailed. Called. She told me the position was mine if I wanted it. She walked me through a short list of terms. The hours were 9 to 4 on weekdays with occasional flexibility required. The pay was what the listing had said. There was a confidentiality agreement to be signed before I met the employer. The agreement was standard, she said, and simply meant I did not discuss the details of the arrangement with anyone outside it. I said yes. She told me to come back to the house on Monday morning at 9. I spent the weekend trying to explain to myself what I had agreed to and not fully succeeding. I had taken a job to be present, to show up, to keep someone company for 6 months. I did not know her name yet. I did not know her age or what her loss had been or what kind of person she was or whether this was going to be the strangest 6 months of my life or something else entirely. I only knew that Monday was coming and that whatever I was walking into, I had said yes to it. And somewhere on the other side of that gray, stone townhouse on Kellerman Street, a woman I had never met was waiting for someone to simply be there. I did not know yet what that would mean. I did not know yet that 6 months would not feel like enough. Her name was Nora Callahan. Petra introduced us on Monday morning in the same sitting room where the interview had taken place. Nora was standing near the window when I came in, looking out at the street below with her hands loosely folded in front of her. She turned when she heard us enter. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, tall, with silver-streaked hair cut short and neat, and the kind of posture that suggested she had grown up being told to stand straight and had simply never stopped. She wore a dark green sweater and looked at me the way people look at someone they are not yet sure about. Not unkindly, just carefully. She did not smile right away. She held out her hand and I shook it and she said my name once. Declan. The way you repeat a name when you are filing it somewhere. Petra excused herself and left us alone in the room, and I had the specific experience of being the only other person in a quiet space with someone I did not know who was watching me decide what to do with my hands. Please sit, Nora said. She sat in one of the chairs by the fireplace. I sat in the other. I should tell you a few things, she said. Her voice was measured and even the voice of someone who had spent a long time choosing words carefully. I am not going to pretend this arrangement is ordinary because it is not. My husband died 8 months ago. We were married for 26 years. I have friends, good ones, but friendship has limits that no one talks about. You cannot ask your friends to be available every single day. You cannot ask them to sit with you through the boring parts of being alive. That is not what friendship is built for. So I made a different arrangement. She looked at me steadily. I do not need someone to take care of me, she said. I am not sick and I am not incapable. I need someone to be here, to have coffee with in the morning, to come with me when I need to go somewhere and would rather not go alone, to be present in the house so that it does not feel like a place where someone used to live. I nodded. I have one rule, she said. Do not perform. If you are bored, I would rather you say so than pretend to be fascinated. If you disagree with something I say, I would like to know. I have enough people in my life who tell me what they think I want to hear. I hired you to be a person, not a mirror. That is a fair rule, I said. She looked at me for a moment as if she was deciding whether I had passed some small test. Good, she said. Would you like coffee? That was how it started. The first week was the strangest professional experience of my life. I arrived at 9 each morning and Petra, who had an office on the upper floor and managed Nora's administrative life with quiet efficiency, would let me in. Nora would already be in the kitchen or the small garden at the back of the house depending on the weather, and we would have coffee and she would read the news on her tablet while I sat across from her and existed. I want to be honest about how uncomfortable that was in the beginning. I was a person who was used to having tasks. I was used to measuring a day by what had been completed. Sitting in a well-furnished kitchen on a Tuesday morning with nothing required of me except presence felt profoundly wrong in a way I could not immediately explain. I kept thinking I should be doing something. I kept looking for something to be useful about. On the third day, Nora looked up from her tablet and said, "You keep looking around the room like you are expecting something to catch fire." I admitted I was not entirely sure what to do with myself. "You are not used to just being somewhere," she said, "without a purpose attached to it." "Not professionally, no," I said. She set down her tablet. "Neither was I," she said. "For most of my life. It is something you have to learn." She was a retired architect. She had run her own firm for 18 years and had stepped back 2 years before her husband got sick, which she said she had always intended to do and which had instead felt like the worst timing possible. Her husband, whose name was Garrett, had been a high school history teacher for 30 years. She said this simply and without elaborating, and I understood from the way she said it that she had told this fact to many people in the past 8 months and had gotten very practiced at delivering it without falling apart. By the end of the first week, I had stopped looking around the room for fires to put out. The second week was easier. We found a rhythm that did not feel manufactured. She walked every morning after coffee, a specific loop through the historic district that took about 40 minutes, and she had begun to ask me to come. We walked and she talked about the buildings we passed with the specific enthusiasm of someone who had spent decades thinking about why structures looked the way they did. I knew enough from my own work to ask real questions, and she seemed to find this satisfying in the way that experts always find it satisfying when someone asks them something that requires an actual answer. On Wednesday of the second week, we stopped in front of a narrow brick building on a corner 2 streets from Kellerman, and she stood looking at it for a long moment. My firm designed that, she said, 20 years ago. I had just started out on my own, and that was the 3rd project I landed. I remember standing on that corner when it was finished and thinking I was going to do this forever. She looked at it for another moment. Garrett came and stood with me on this corner the day it was finished, she said. He brought sandwiches. He always brought food to things because he said celebrating on an empty stomach was wasteful. She said it the way people say things they have said in their own heads many times and are now saying out loud for maybe the first time. We stood there for a moment. He sounds like someone who paid attention, I said. She looked at me sideways. Yes, she said. He was very good at that. We kept walking. That was the moment I understood what I was actually there for. Not to fill silence with noise. Not to manage her schedule or run her errands or keep her entertained. I was there to be a witness. To be the person standing on the corner when she stopped to look at something that mattered. To be present without demanding anything back. It was not nothing. I was beginning to understand quite a lot. The 3rd week brought the first genuinely hard day. I arrived on a Tuesday to find her already in the sitting room, not in the kitchen, which was unusual. She was sitting in the chair by the cold fireplace with a cup of tea she had not touched and an expression that was not grief exactly but was the thing that lives next to grief when grief has been going on long enough to become part of the furniture. I sat down in the other chair and did not say anything. We sat like that for almost 20 minutes. Eventually she said today is the first day we would have been back in this house together since he died. She said it evenly. He always came back from his brother's place in Savannah on the 3rd Tuesday of the month. 26 years. He would walk through that door at 11:30 with his coat still on and put the kettle on before he even took his shoes off. I looked at the front door. 11:30, she said, and looked at the clock on the mantel. It was 11:24. We sat in silence until the clock moved past 11:30. Then she picked up her tea and took a sip and looked at me. Thank you, she said, for not saying anything useful. That is my greatest skill, I said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was the first time I had heard that sound from her, and it landed somewhere specific. 3 weeks in, I thought, and I was only beginning to understand the shape of what I had walked into. I did not know yet what the next 5 months would look like. I did not know yet what I would find out about Nora Callahan or what she would find out about me or how the last day of those 6 months would arrive and what it would ask of both of us. I only knew that on the 3rd Tuesday of that first month I had sat in a chair and watched a clock and done nothing else. And it had been exactly right. By the 2nd month the arrangement had stopped feeling strange. That was its own kind of strange. I noticed it on a Wednesday in what must have been week 7. When I arrived at 9 and Nora was already in the garden with 2 cups of coffee on the small iron table and a book open in her lap, and she looked up when she heard the gate and said, "You are 2 minutes early," and I said, "I know," and sat down and picked up my cup, and that was it. No explanation needed. No performance of arrival. Just 2 people continuing something that had already been going on. I want to be precise about what those days looked like because I think people hear the words keeping someone company and imagine something soft and uncomplicated. It was not. Not always. Nora was not easy. She was direct in a way that occasionally felt like being lightly hit with something. She had opinions about everything and delivered them without softening them first and expected you to respond in kind. She did not want to be agreed with. She wanted to be engaged. There were conversations over that kitchen table that required me to actually think about architecture and city planning and history and memory and what it meant to build something that outlasted the person who built it. She pushed back on everything I said that was lazy or half-formed, and when I made a real argument she leaned back in her chair with something that was not quite satisfaction but was close to it. She was also, on certain days, completely unreachable. Not unkind. Just absent in the way that grief makes people absent, present in body and somewhere else entirely in every way that mattered. On those days I learned not to try to pull her back. I learned to just be in the room and let her be wherever she was. I would bring something to read or I would sit in the garden and she would move around the house doing small tasks and eventually she would come and sit near me and the absence would lift. Not because of anything I had done, but because time had moved and she had let it. I talked to my roommate about it in the evenings. Not the details, the confidentiality agreement covered those, but the general shape of it. I told him I was spending my days with someone who was learning how to be alone in a house that used to have 2 people in it. He was quiet for a second. "Is it depressing?" he asked. I thought about it. "No," I said. "It is heavy sometimes. But not depressing. There is a difference." He asked what the difference was. I said depressing is when something has no meaning. Heavy is when it has too much. He told me that sounded like something I had read somewhere. I told him I thought I had worked it out in the moment. He said, "Sure you did." The 3rd month brought something I had not anticipated. Nora began asking about me. Not in the way employers ask about employees, that polite and bounded curiosity that stops at the professional border. She asked in the way she did everything directly and without much warning. We were on our morning walk in what must have been week 9 or 10 when she said without preamble, "What ended your last relationship?" I looked at her sideways. "You do not have to answer," she said. "But you have heard a great deal about my life and I know almost nothing about yours and I find that lopsided." Her name was Kara, I said. "We were together for 2 years. I ended it and I have spent considerable time since wondering if that was the right thing." She walked beside me for a moment. "Why did you end it?" she said. "Because I was comfortable," I said. And I confused comfortable with content, and by the time I understood the difference I had been there long enough that leaving felt like a loss even though staying felt like standing still. She nodded slowly. "That is an honest answer," she said. "You have a rule about honesty," I said. "I do," she said. "What are you going to do about her?" "I have no idea," I said. She nodded again as if that was also an acceptable answer. I thought about Kara more after that conversation than I had in months. Not because Nora had solved anything or told me what to do, but because she had asked in a way that required me to actually form the thought out loud, and once a thought is out loud it is harder to put back where it was. That was the thing about Nora. She asked questions the way architects looked at buildings. Not to admire them, but to understand how they were holding up and where the pressure was and what might give way if you pushed in the wrong place. She was doing that with me without making it feel like a project. In the 4th month, she showed me the studio. It was on the 3rd floor, a room I had never been in, with north-facing windows and a long drafting table and shelves of architectural models going back what looked like decades. Small buildings and structures in white and gray cardboard, some finished and polished, some still in rough form, some clearly personal and never built. She had started going up there in the mornings before I arrived, she said. She had not been in that room since Garrett died. She was not building anything yet, but she had started being in the space again, which was different and which was, she said, more than she had managed in the past several months. She showed me a model on the far end of the shelf. A small house, simple and low to the ground, with a wide open plan and large window cutouts facing what would have been south. "We designed this together," she said. "Garrett and me. We were going to build it somewhere outside the city when we retired. It was never going to happen exactly as drawn, but we kept refining it anyway for years. It was something we did in the evenings sometimes instead of watching television." She looked at it for a moment. "He was not an architect," she said. But he understood space. He understood what it felt like to be inside something and whether it felt right or not. That is rarer than the technical knowledge, actually. Plenty of architects lose that. I looked at the model. The proportions were careful and human. It felt like somewhere a person would actually want to be. "It is a good house," I said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She put it back on the shelf and we went back downstairs, and I did not say anything else about it, and neither did she. But the next morning when I arrived, she was already upstairs in the studio. And the morning after that, the 5th month arrived quietly. We had settled into something that had its own shape and its own logic. She was sleeping better, she told me one morning without being asked, which was new. She had called one of her old friends from the firm, a woman named Ruth who had moved to Portland 2 years earlier and whom she had been avoiding without fully admitting to herself that she was doing so. The call had gone on for 2 hours. She told me this the way she told me most things, plainly and without asking for a response, but I noticed that she told me it all. I noticed a lot of small things by the 5th month. The way she had started laughing more easily. Not the polite kind, but the sudden kind that arrived without warning when something struck her as genuinely absurd. The way she had started talking about future plans in the present tense instead of the conditional. The way she occasionally referred to something we had talked about weeks earlier, as if the continuity between those conversations was simply a given. She was not the same person I had met in that sitting room on a cold Monday morning 4 months before. Neither, I was realizing, was I. And with 5 months now behind us, only one remained. I had stopped thinking about the end date the way I had in the beginning. In the beginning it had felt like a clear horizon, 6 months, a defined term, a professional arrangement with a finish line. Now it felt like something I had stopped looking at directly because looking at it directly produced a feeling I had not budgeted for. I had not said anything to Nora about it. I was not sure she had not noticed. The last month came in without announcing itself the way last things sometimes do. I noticed it on a Monday when I arrived and Petra met me at the door instead of letting me in through the side gate the way she usually did on mornings when Nora was in the garden. Petra handed me a coffee and said Nora had asked to speak with me in the sitting room. She said it in her usual tone, which was calm and gave nothing away. But there was something in the way she handed me the coffee that felt like the way people hand you something before a conversation they are not certain you are ready for. I went to the sitting room. Nora was already there, standing near the window. She turned when I came in. She was not doing the careful measured look she had given me on the very first day. She was doing something harder to read. "I am aware," she said, "that we have 4 weeks left." "Yes," I said. She looked at the window for a moment and then looked back at me. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer with the honesty rule in effect." "All right," I said. "Has this been difficult for you?" she said. "Not the work. I know the work has been manageable. I mean this, being here, doing something that does not produce anything visible." I thought about it the way she had always asked me to think about things, before answering instead of while answering. "In the beginning, yes," I said. "I kept waiting for a task. I kept feeling like I was failing at something by just being present. But that passed. And what replaced it was something I did not have a word for at the time." "What word do you have for it now?" she said. I looked at her. "Necessary," I said. "It started feeling necessary. Not just for you. For me." She held my gaze for a moment. "You are going to be fine," she said. "After this. I want you to know I believe that. You are a person who knows how to be present without disappearing into someone else's life, and that is not as common as it should be." I did not know what to say to that, so I said thank you, and she nodded and sat down, and the conversation moved on the way conversations did between us, without ceremony. But I carried what she said with me for the rest of that day. The final weeks moved differently from the ones before them. There was the same rhythm, the coffee and the walks and the mornings in the garden and the conversations that went wherever they needed to go. But underneath all of it there was something new now, a kind of a tension that comes when you know something is ending and you want to be fully inside it while it is still happening. On a Thursday in the 3rd week of that last month, we went to the botanical garden on the east side of the city. Nora had mentioned it in passing weeks earlier, and I had suggested we go, and she had said maybe, and then one morning she had simply said Thursday, with the expectation that I would know what she meant. I did. It was a clear morning, cool enough for a jacket, and the garden was not crowded. We walked the long path that curved through the older section where the trees were established and tall, and the light came through them in the particular way that light comes through old trees. Slowly and in pieces. She was quiet for most of it, but not the heavy quiet of those early weeks. It was a different kind of quiet. The kind that is full rather than empty. We stopped on a bench near the far end of the path where a wide flower bed was laid out in careful rows. Garrett would have liked this, she said. He liked things that were tended. Things that someone had decided to keep. She said it without the bracing quality she had used in those first months when she said his name. She said it the way you say something true about someone you loved. Plainly and without needing to do anything with the feeling afterward. I looked at the flower bed. He sounds like he was a person worth keeping around, I said. He was, she said. And then, quietly, so were you. I did not answer right away. The morning moved around us, slow and bright and without any particular concern for what was happening on that bench. Eventually I said, I do not think this is the kind of thing that stops at 6 months. She looked at me. I mean that I am going to want to know how the studio goes, I said, and whether that house ever gets built, and how Ruth is doing in Portland. Those are not things I am going to be comfortable not knowing. She was quiet for a moment. What are you suggesting? She said. I am suggesting that whatever this was, I said, it does not have to end on an arbitrary date we picked before either of us knew what it was going to become. She looked at the flower bed for a long moment. You would need to find actual employment, she said. I am not going to keep paying you to have coffee with me. I know that, I said. She was quiet again. There is a firm, she said slowly. A friend of mine runs it. Small, serious work. She has been looking for a project coordinator for 2 months, and I have been not mentioning it to you because I did not want you to feel managed. How long have you known about it? I said. 6 weeks, she said. I looked at her. She met my look without apology. I was working up to it, she said. We sat on the bench in the botanical garden for a little while longer. The light moved through the old trees. A woman pushed a stroller along the path behind us. 2 pigeons investigated the flower bed briefly and then lost interest and left. Send me the details, I said. She said she would. The last day came on a Friday. I arrived at 9 the way I had arrived every weekday for 6 months. Through the side gate and into the garden where Nora was already sitting with coffee on the iron table. The weather had turned properly cold, and there was a blanket over her knees and a second one folded on my chair. I sat down and pulled the blanket across my lap and picked up my coffee. We did not make a ceremony of it. That was not who either of us was. We talked about the studio, which she was now spending 2 mornings a week in. She had started a new model, nothing commissioned, just something she wanted to build to see if the idea held together. She described it with the technical precision she used when she was genuinely interested in something, and I listened and asked the questions that were real, and she answered them fully, and we drank our coffee while the morning got brighter around us. At some point she mentioned that the firm was called Okafor and Associates, and that her friend's name was Diane, and that she had already spoken to Diane about me, and that Diane was expecting my call before the end of the week. I said I would call that afternoon. Good, she said. We finished the coffee. The blankets kept out most of the cold. A bird landed briefly on the garden wall, thought better of it, and left. At 5 minutes to 4 I stood up from the iron chair. She looked up at me. Same time Monday, she said. Diane is not going to fire you for being somewhere else first thing in the morning. I looked at her. That is not in the contract, I said. There is no contract anymore, she said. That is the point. I looked at her for a moment. This woman who had hired a stranger to sit with her through the hardest stretch of her life and who had, somewhere in the middle of all of it, without making any announcement about it, become one of the most important people I knew. Same time Monday, I said. She nodded and looked back at her garden with the specific expression of someone who has gotten exactly what they wanted and is not going to make a performance of it. I let myself out through the side gate and walked to my car and sat in it for a minute before starting the engine. 6 months, I thought. 6 months of doing nothing, technically. 6 months of just being present in the same space as another person who needed someone to witness the slow and unglamorous work of continuing forward. I had gone in thinking I was doing her a favor. I started the car and pulled out onto the street. The job at Okafor and Associates started 3 weeks later. The work was good and the people were serious, and I found that I was better at being present in a room than I had ever been before, which turned out to matter more in that kind of work than I had previously understood. I had coffee with Nora every Monday morning for the rest of that year. Then the year after that. The model on her drafting table grew slowly into something with its own logic and its own rightness. On a Tuesday evening in the following spring, she called me up to the studio to look at it, and I stood at the table and looked at what she had built, and it was careful human work. The kind of structure that felt lived in before anyone had ever lived in it. "That is the best one yet," I said. She looked at it. "Almost," she said. "Not yet." She picked up a small piece of cardboard and made an adjustment I could not fully see and set it back down and looked at it again. "Now," she said. I looked at it. "Yes," I said. "Now." She turned off the studio light and we went downstairs, and she put the kettle on, and we stood in the kitchen of the gray stone house on Kellerman Street while the spring evening settled around the city outside. Quiet and particular and entirely ordinary, which was, I had come to understand, the best kind of thing there was.